David Graieg. How are you doing today?
Yeah, doing great. Thanks. Over in Perth, Western Australia.
I was down under in November. I gave a talk, a couple talks at Australian Catholic University. Um, so that was the closest I got to you.
Yep. Thanks. I do follow you on Facebook, so I appreciate your working on. I did see that, and that's great. Yeah, obviously sad no one gets over to Perth, although I don't blame them. It is meant to be one of the most remote cities in the world, so yeah, it's a long way to
Wow.
come.
Wow. Very good. Yeah, well, so I had the chance, the pleasure to read your latest book on memory and the resurrection of Jesus, where you kind of apply what seems to me, at least. So you have to uh, understand I'm but a mere philosopher. Who has an interest in biblical studies? My undergrad was actually in biblical studies, but I haven't kept up with it as probably as I ought. But from my circles, from my experience, it seems like all the rage these days is to ditch the traditional criteria, so dissimilarity, multiple attestation, criterion of embarrassment, that sort of thing. Ditch these and instead focus on reliability of memory and kind of general just memory being reliable and being able to try to um, see what can be remembered and if they're going to remember it reliably and so on and so forth. And maybe we can kind of have a different sort of argument for the resurrection. One that's not so much for those familiar with like Lacona, my good friend, or William Lane Craig, right? Minimal facts from these historical criteria to the resurrection of Jesus. Instead, kind of a much more Dale Allison style approach to use another person that maybe my listeners are familiar with. But so, can you go ahead and explain that a little bit? Maybe just why is it that the criteria has seen um, some pushback, if we can say, some pushback, and what is this kind of alternative method that you're primarily utilizing throughout your work?
Yep. Yeah, no, thanks for some of the comments. Like, yeah, appreciate. So yeah, the book, I guess, just for the readers, those interested, it's a little bit heavy, but hopefully it's got some useful things in there as well. Resurrection Remembered. And I'd want to say I think everyone should be more of a philosopher, which is to say, right, the unexamined life isn't worth living, and just like a unexamined sort of biblical studies or something like that is going to be worth its weight. So I fall short there. I need more of that. But in response to your question, yeah, with the criteria and the shift. I'd say yes, there has been in general a shift in biblical studies where they're definitely less popular. That's not to say there aren't scholars who don't still advocate it, such as Kevin Burr has a book, Authenticating Criteria in Jesus Research and Beyond, 2023, which still makes the case for like responsible use of the criteria. Or others, a scholar like Zolondek has a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus Methodology. Again, that's still advocating for criteria. In fact, he would say that criteria just is used in all historical studies. It's not unique to biblical studies. So yeah, so there's still people advocating it. But you're right, particularly since Hooker's 1972 article called On Using the Wrong Tool, or someone like Dale Allison's as a 2009 article called How to Marginalize the Traditional Criteria of Authenticity. Yep. And probably most of all is Chris Keith and Anthony the Don were the editors of a book called Jesus Criteria and the Demise of Authenticity in 2012. And yeah, I'd say sort of since then, there's almost, particularly from those who aren't keen on it, an assumption that there's no real need to further interact with work on it because it's sort of like a settled matter. Also, some of the reasons why they've left the criteria is going to depend on the individuals, but I think someone like Chris Keith would say that, well, the criteria were tied to form criticism, and form criticism is basically done away with, so the criteria being tied to them goes away too. And briefly, just to mention this, so form criticism basically says that there were these individual pericopes or units or passages of a scripture, and that these were tied to a particular literary form, such that like whether it's a miracle story or a pronouncement story, they're saying there was this setting in the early church life that gave sort of rise to them Yeah. And so, yeah, things have been critiqued about form criticism. And so he would say the criteria goes with it. There have been responses. So, like the guy Michael Metz had an article called Neglected Discontinuity Between Early Form Criticism and the Next Quest, in which he says, like, no, there is a distinction between form criticism and the criteria. So people, have responded to this, but that would be, yeah, one of the key reasons. Another sort of issue why people have left behind the criteria is it depends, well, they often call the criteria of authenticity, right? And so it depends, what do you mean by authentic? And so some in these circles would say, well, authentic is something that's free from interpretation, and particularly in sort of like a postmodern type of interpretation, they'd say nothing is free from interpretation. And so you just don't have anything that's authentic. Yep. Other scholars, though, are going to say authentic basically just means that it probably goes back to the historical Jesus, in which case, then, yeah, you could say there's still authentic stuff. Yes, it's interpreted through a certain perspective, but it doesn't mean that something that is interpreted is just automatically wrong or to be dismissed. Others, if you like, have dismissed the criteria because they would say, look, it's produced all these different results. Like scholars claim to use the criteria to give them objectivity, but the reality is they're still painting Jesus in their own image. So, yeah, like, are they of any use? Joel Archer has a 2025 article in the Journal of Historical Jesus Studies entitled Consensus Disagreement and the Criteria of Authenticity, which says that that's not a good reason to abandon it, and that even in other fields, there's guides on how to do work and logic and reason, but people get different results. And so he's saying maybe there are reasons to reject criteria of authenticity, but disagreement is not automatically just one of them. I think I might sort of cheekily add that I would also say a reason why some scholars have dismissed the criteria of authenticity is that they haven't engaged some of the best works that use the criteria. I'm thinking here of Bock and Webb have a book called Key Events in the Life of Historical Jesus, which is like actually I think it's somewhere behind me, but it's like a 600 plus page tome that just looks at 12 events in the life of Jesus and says, like, this is how we could use it. And I actually think, yeah, that's a really scholarly, responsible use of the criteria. And in general, those who have critiqued the criteria haven't even mentioned that. So it's like you haven't engaged one of the strongest sources. But admittedly, if they did, they'd probably say there's problems. But, I would just want to say, well, you haven't yet. So maybe if you did that. Last thing to sort of say, sorry, I know you're asking about memory, but still on the criteria, is not all do say that it should be done away with. Some people are just warning that there's potential misuses, and so you should have responsible use of it. Yeah, and I think that's more the case. But in the last couple of years, then, the sort of the quest for historical Jesus, with which it's generally framed as there being three, and then people have critiqued that and said there are other quests as well, but just using that framework, in the last couple of years, they've gone to have a fourth-ish quest and a next quest. Yeah, and so generally those who are advocating for the next quest have said, yeah, the criteria is gone, but those who are advocating for a fourth quest say the criteria can still be used alongside John's gospel. So yeah, that's sort of the criteria, and to say, yes, it has generally shifted. There's various reasons, the discussion's still ongoing. But your sort of question asked then, yeah, so what's the memory approach, the memory way of doing it? Yeah, and basically there's also sort of a diversity of how to do it. So someone called Thomas Hoovercain has a book called The Quest for the Memory of Jesus in 2020, and he argues that within the memory approach, there isn't just one single way of doing the memory approach. There are in fact different memory approaches. And so in that sense, he would say scholars have to lay out and explain how they're going to go it. And I've largely followed Rob McIver. He was one of my PhD supervisors, and his book is called Memory, Jesus, and the Synoptic Gospels.
Yep.
And so I would say I added more recent works on the psychology of memory, as well as, by and large, most biblical scholars have not engaged with the philosophy of memory. And so I thought that was a huge field. I'm not sure you remember, I think I emailed you briefly and you got some recommendations from Alvin Plantinga and his work on memory on that. So yeah, I think there's a whole mind of stuff that's valuable about that. And so I try to bring that into the field, like the discussion, and say memory, there's more aspects, there's more larger things to consider, and that. But which is to say, memory studies basically is saying that if something is historical, if it's the product of memory, then we can use modern studies from psychology, from philosophy about memory to say, are there some insights on that, like how it'd be understood? And not to sort of complicate it, but so yeah, I lay out like 20 something factors that could have varying relevance. And so yeah, you just sort of look through each one and say, like, is it the distance from the source? Is it how significant a memory it is? Is it social aspects of memory? Could there be suggestions that implanted false memories in people and stuff like that? And that's sort of a memory approach to how you'd go about it.
And so specifically, right? I mean, 1 Corinthians 15, the large, or the, what, at least from my encounters, you can correct me if I'm wrong, most scholars seem to think that 1 Corinthians 15, that there is a oral tradition. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I think around verses 2 or 3 to 7, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
That predates Paul, predates his letter. It doesn't actually come from Paul. And then this is something that's going to be very kind of an early witness to there being memory of the resurrected Jesus. Can you talk a little bit about that and why scholars think that this is a oral tradition and so forth that he's using?
Yeah, you're right about that. Particularly, there'd be several passages in the New Testament, and I guess in general, they're going to say it's everything wasn't written down upon hearing. So there was a oral tradition period behind the Gospels as well. But particularly for 1 Corinthians 3 to 7, it's generally thought to be an early oral tradition. In terms of the term oral tradition, I think popularly we just say oral tradition is referring to anything orally that's passed on. Scholars will technically, and not actually everyone does this, but those who do, they would say oral tradition refers to traditions after the lifetime of what the events happen, and oral history is events within the lifetime. So strictly speaking, if 1 Corinthians is legitimate, which most scholars think it is within the lifetime of the event. So it's actually oral history. But actually, most people don't use that. So if you just talk about oral tradition, that's totally fine. It's sort of umbrella term for both. But so why do they think that is the case here? It is basically because for several reasons, but it begins with the terminology of paradidomi, meaning passed on, and paralambano, to receive. And so these were the traditional rabbinic terms, and also in Greek schools as well, for the training of others, like handing on tradition, stuff like this. Like, just, whether it's philosophy or Plato, Aristotle, or something like that. Yeah. And so it's already sort of invoking this terminology of like training, passing on there. And then we see Paul says this was something that he received and he taught the Corinthians. And then he also says, this is not just what I teach. This is what in verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 15, he says, this is what, all the Christians, all the apostles and are teaching as well. I guess you could say he's like bluffing it, like he made it up. But then there's also non-Pauline vocabulary in the creed, which would suggest that it's not typical of him. It doesn't guarantee it, but it makes it more probable that, he's not the author of this, because he's got expressions he doesn't normally use, such as for our sins, or according to the scriptures, or he was buried and that he was raised on the third day, or he was seen by the 12. These are all not Pauline style. So it's suggesting it doesn't originate with him. More for it being a creed, if you like. There's some parallelism, like, and some repetition of on the scriptures twice. It's like that Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised, and that he appeared. So there's some sort of meter sort of to it in some ways. So it's, all this sort of suggests that, it was an early oral tradition. There's debate whether it actually ends at verse 5, and then whether verses 6 and 7 are an addition. It's generally thought, though, that it's not an addition by Paul, but there could have been two competing creeds, and Paul sort of like combined them, if anything. Though there are people who think, no, it's all just one thing. And I guess scholarship can get a little bit speculative at trying to sig and see. And I would sort of say, like, for our purposes, the point is there is oral tradition. There is some history and memory that's gone in that can be studied and see, hey, what did the early Christians believe about Jesus' resurrection? And in like that regard, then, sorry, if you like, is like when it came, there's debate. You mentioned Dale Allison, his 2021 book, The Resurrection of Jesus, which is a great
Mhm.
book. He was one of my PhD examiners.
Nice.
But yeah, and it's actually probably the main person I interact with in
Yeah.
my book, actually.
Right.
But yeah, uh, he would say that, all we can know for certain is that the Creed was written sometime before the writing of First
Mhm.
Corinthians in the mid
Mhm.
50s, so 20 years. And I would say, strictly speaking, he is correct about that. That's all you can know for certain as such. But it still remains more probable with like other scholars. Someone like James Dunn would say it actually was formulated within months of happening, and
Right.
most scholars
Like
say
6
within,
months or something, he says, I think,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And most say within just a few years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they've generally lined it up either with Acts 9, when Paul's on the way, the
Mhm.
road to Damascus, like he talks to Ananias there, forgetting the name, Annas. And so they say maybe that's when he received it. Or others have said in Galatians 1:18, like Paul goes to Jerusalem and talks with Peter and James, who are two people mentioned in the Creed.
Mhm.
Like maybe that's, and so yeah, you are talking about a few years. Some scholars would want to say maybe he heard it like from people like Stephen, who was involved in the stoning of, so he even heard it before like Christians saying it and stuff like that.
So here, you talked earlier about kind of looking at memory and kind of adjudicating between what memory is more likely to have some truth corresponding to it rather than say a fake memory or a faulty memory, something like that. And so clearly here we have an early source and reference to what's being remembered. But you also talk about how um, when it comes into kind of a social setting, that that there could be kind of new ramifications for memory. So you might think that citing the memory together as a society might actually make it the case that it's more likely that the memory is going to be remembered in the future. And you point to passages as well, like where it seems like the apostles are teaching certain things on the first day of the week, and they're breaking bread and talking about the death and resurrection of Jesus and that sort of thing. So I don't know, any thoughts or comments kind of about how the social society or the attempts to recite it maybe frequently, the oral tradition, might make it be the case that 1 Corinthians 15 has a pretty reliable memory.
Yep. Yeah. It's a couple things, both the social aspects and just the repetitive nature of that. And it's generally to say, if you, well, how most people, students practice for homework and assignments is by, you don't just, okay, like I heard it once, done. You study over it, you repeat it. And like if you're learning music or something, like you got to practice regularly and it gets it in. And the same basic thing with memory. If you turn something over in your short-term memory, it eventually sort of gets into your long-term memory and it's there. And so, yeah, if the Christians, witnessed something about Jesus' death and coming back, but didn't write it down for decades later, then would say, hey, there is a chance they remember it rightly, but it is decreased because, that if they haven't been touching it for 20 odd years. But, if they're talking about it regularly, such as if they have like, weekly church gatherings and, perhaps if it changed from on a Sabbath, a Saturday to a Sunday because of something like they believe that's the day of the Lord when he rose again, or if they have a regular practice of like the Eucharist, remembering Jesus' death until he comes again, like his resurrection as well. These would all be things that are going to reinforce that memory, right? And there's also social aspects of that in that community, and that's also going to reinforce. It's not like it's just one person who's dependent on remembering this, but there is that sort of web of community that sort of strengthens it. Yeah. And this is generally what you do see. If you read the Gospels, you'll see that as soon as people hear about Jesus' resurrection, they actually are talking about it and telling others. Yep. Likewise, in the book of Acts, then, the common thing that they're preaching on, I'm sure they did talk about things like the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan, but what we do find evidence of in the book of Acts is they're talking about Jesus' death and resurrection. Like that is the key thing. And that's also what you see in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says in, I think it's roughly verse 3, verse 2, that this was of first importance, which could be understood as saying this is the first thing we tell other Christians, or could also say it's the most crucial thing that we tell. It could even be a bit of both there. But yeah, and so this was something that the Christians saw as central, they're talking about, so they are repetitively sort of refreshing it, recalling it into memory, which would, all things be equal, make us think, yeah, it's more reliably remembered.
So it would be kind of like, if you had to if you had to create a story where a memory kind of became kind of a reliable staple for a community, you would expect for the community to be reciting the memory or the events of the memory related to memory on a regular basis. You would expect for the community to kind of maybe take on the memory for themselves to a certain degree. You would see it guarded, I guess, is what I'm getting at, kind of guarding the memory to make sure nothing, goes in or out of what's being recited. And this is the sort of stuff that we see, right? This is the sort of stuff that we see with 1 Corinthians 15.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. In terms of the guarding, I don't think you could fully control what's said. Like some stuff, people are going to travel, say their own things, and you get communities. I mean, in some ways, that's kind of what's happened in Corinth, right? That Paul actually has to bring this up because we want to say this would seem to be the creed that was taught in all churches, in the churches in Galatia or Ephesus and stuff like this, but we don't have it recorded there. And in a sense, why then in Corinth? Is because I think there's a mixture of probably a philosophy and people saying, hey, people don't rise from the dead. Resurrections don't happen. And so Paul's sort of saying like, no, this is what we taught you. This is what you all believe. And here's sort of how it can make sense in light of some of this. So you do have a bit of guarding of it there, but you don't have like full control, which is partly to say why there are people who are like, hey, no, resurrections don't happen. I guess the weird thing is we only get one side of the conversation, but it would appear that the Corinthians did say that, Jesus rose, but then they were saying, that was, I don't know, just him. It's not going to happen to you. And Paul sort of needs to correct that by saying, no, we're firmly agree that Jesus rose. This is the tradition. This is what we're all taught. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. So going back a little bit on memory, so there are various studies that I've even looked at, because this seems like an interesting sort of approach. So my own interests, and the studies do seem to indicate that big picture memory is reliable. You might forget what cars were involved in a car accident, what color the cars were, how many people exactly, but you still remember you saw a guy fly through, the roof of his car, right, from because he didn't have a seatbelt on or something like that. And so it's like, 5 years later, you can still recall, there was a horrible accident, right? And so, I mean, is this how you read the field, kind of the memory studies? Is this kind of a sympathetic kind of view of memory that's largely shared with those in New Testament studies and in memory studies?
Yeah, there's, I guess, I feel like you probably know this better than I, in the sense that in philosophy, there's people who can deny that we both exist, right? Solipsism or something like that. So there is every view across the spectrum. But yes, in general, people would say that just memories are reliable, just the general version of it. So in biblical studies, someone like Zebra Cook comes close to saying that, no, you can't even trust the gist of things. I mean, I would say he's technically correct that you can get the gist wrong, but the reality is you generally don't, though. Yeah. And in that sense, it's really more a matter of what do we think in this particular case. And if you read several of the books on just the psychology of memory. It may be a book about memory distortion. I think Daniel Satcher's books, he'll say like, this is about memory distortion and all the problems, but the reality is memory is generally reliable and it can be trusted. And it kind of has to be that way, right? If it wasn't, we couldn't trust anything. We couldn't trust that we remember our names. How do we know we've just forgot like pure language and stuff like this? And so actually memory almost has to be assumed as something that's like, it must generally work. And then we'd want to say, hey, but in these circumstances, do we have reason to trust it, or why? Yeah, and so I was saying in my book, I look at sort of 21 factors that I think of memory could apply to Jesus' resurrection and look at them. And, I think a few of them are indecisive. Like you talked a bit about a car crash. Yeah, that's sort of discussed. And so people have found like if you suggest things, you can kind of like implant with like a leading question and say like, hey, how fast were the cars going when they blank? And if you say smash when the car's smashed, it's more likely that people remember it being faster because that, or they remember there being glass there, even though there wasn't in that. But if you kind of have a more neutral question, yeah. And so we don't know exactly what was sort of said to the first disciples. I mean, you could, I guess, say that there was young men or angels at the tomb who said, he's not here, he's risen. Yep. And then say like, oh, that's implanted certain things and stuff like that. And so there are elements that could make you wonder, but by and large, I think the creed of First Corinthians is just that Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised, that he appeared. That is that sort of gist. And I think there's very good reasons to affirm that that could have been remembered, years or decades later, as a key thing. And basically, one of the key reasons I'd say that is just what's known as sort of flashbulb memories, which is to say, not all memories equal. Some are going to be more significant, distinct. So most of the example, these are kind of sad. Like depending on when you've lived, it's things like, where were you to remember the events of the end of World War II, or things like September 11th. Yep. And then by and large, like people may not know what they did on September 10th or 9th, but they can remember September 11th. I mean, actually, if you're going to get more detail there, studies have found that people often think they have really high confidence, but it's not always as sure, although it's generally for those who are actually involved in the events that they do remember. I mean, sorry, seeing as I brought it up, I guess. So those who are in New York in September 11th, yeah, they do remember, whereas perhaps those, say, in Texas or something, they still sometimes do, but they're often to have high confidence, but there's less certainty if they can verify with like a calendar exactly what I was doing or wearing. I had a photo that day. Yeah, but I guess my point would be with the disciples then, they were people who had spent their 3 years with Jesus. They'd left their lives of fishing, tax collecting to follow this guy. They thought he was going to be the Messiah. They had seen him do miracles and teachings and stuff like this, but then he gets crucified. And so you'd be like, well, that's the end of it. But it's not the end of it. Something changed. And if it is a resurrection, that would really sort of be burnt in the memory, be something strong, be sort of life-changing. And that's what we seem to see, right? In the book of Acts, they go on talking about it for like the rest of their lives, even if there's persecution and trouble and stuff like that.
Yeah. So like what we have here is a memory that is early in the sense that the where we see the memory and the where the event had to take occurs, not too many years, right? It's small span for corruption that could take place and that sort of thing. And we see that maybe there was some guardrails for protecting the memory. I know you talk about this in one of the chapters. I just can't remember all the language that you use. Okay. But they're repeating it likely to each other on Sundays and throughout the days of the weeks. And then there's some kind of corporal element as well that might help solidify or establish its firmness. So here, if general just memory is reliable, right? We have some memory in 1 Corinthians 15. I think, and maybe you disagree with me, I don't know. I think that you can even get that in the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, where even if you think, oh yeah, that's full of lots and lots of made up stuff and later theologically reflections and stuff that are within the gospel resurrection narratives, nonetheless, it seems like you have a memory of Jesus being seen by his disciples. So you have good reason to think, no, people did believe this, and not too long after the fact.
Yep.
So that's what I take your work to be doing. But then I guess the question I have would be, what do you do with those who say, well, couldn't they have just made all this up, right? Couldn't they have just said that they remembered Jesus, but actually, they weren't? I mean, people can just say stuff all the time. Why? Maybe they just said stuff all the time here. And then secondly, maybe they were hallucinating, and so maybe they were sincere, weren't just making it up as they go. But nonetheless, it's can be understood through some sort of hallucination theory.
Yeah, and I got you there. Yeah, so that is a big issue. I don't cover it. Actually, part of the reason I didn't cover it is my supervisors wanted this to be a biblical studies dissertation, and that was my focus. And to go into some of this, they felt like that makes it more apologetics. It would sort of change how publishers and others see it. That being said, I actually do have a journal article coming out called Resurrection Misremembered instead of Resurrection Remembered. I had to grab that title for someone else who critiques me. That looks at some of these other options and says, like, yeah, how do we know it's not a fabrication? How do we know it's not hallucination? And stuff like that. And so there's a few things you could say. One of which is to say that most people, when they read the New Testament, think that the Christians are being sincere. They might be sincerely wrong, but yeah, they are being sincere about it, which is to say the idea that they're just making up and fabricating is unlikely. Combined with the fact that they did face persecution, people who are in a position to know the truth are generally not going to lie and make a willing martyr of themselves. I don't cover the case for martyrship and stuff like this. Someone like Sean McDowell's book, The Fate of the Apostles, of which the second edition just came out, covers that in good detail. Or I actually want to say in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 32, you do have perhaps one of the earliest cases of some persecution, martyrdom. Namely, Paul says that he fought with wild beasts in Ephesus. And actually, one thing you'll see in my book is I agreed with, I would say, the majority of scholars there, saying that it's probably taken metaphorically. But I've actually since changed my mind. There you go. And that is James Ware has a book called The Final Triumph of God, which came out this year. Yeah, and I think he spends roughly 500 pages on 1 Corinthians. I only spent 100 pages. So there you go. And then he discusses that in depth and says, like, no, this is probably a case of literal fighting wild beasts and persecution. And I think he's probably right there. So, yep. That's to say, yeah, there's persecution in the early church. Yep. And so they're not likely just to be making this up willy-nilly. Again, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if Christ has not been raised, then our faith is worthless, we're still in our sins, which is to say, he's facing like eternal punishment in his own mind. So why would he just be doing this? And it just becomes sort of more ad hoc and conspiratorial to say like, oh yeah, he just would say that because that way they would think he's actually telling the truth, but he's not. But again, we'd want to say there was non-Pauline vocabulary, so it doesn't look like it came with him. This is what meant to be the whole community is sort of believing. And if you do look at other New Testament writings, whether it's Acts, Peter's writings, we still have mention of Jesus' death and resurrection. So this, is a key thing. If you look at the genre of the Gospels, generally thought to be historical documents, ancient bibliographies, bios, sort of thing, suggesting they are making historical claims. You could even say, outside the New Testament, there's things like the Didache, the Apostolic Fathers, that again seem to treat this as real things, not just as a fictional like Harry Potter story or something like that. Or likewise, there's even non-Christian writers like Josephus, Tacitus, Philly the Younger, who also talk about these as if they're historical things. So that's to say the making up category doesn't work well. And I guess in general, you would say there's also other places where then if Christians were just going to make up stuff, why don't they just ad hoc, like do it on the spot? And so there was dispute in the early church about Gentiles and saying whether or not they should be circumcised. And it would have been super easy just to invent and say, hey, Jesus said such and such. but that's not the sort of route they seem to take in general about resolving matters and stuff like that. And so that's even like a of lesser importance thing. And so more of their central thing about Jesus' death and resurrection, it would seem that that's an unlikely candidate, and like there's good reasons to reject that, if that helps. You also asked about hallucination, or sorry, I didn't ever got to that. If you want me to say anything there?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, and this is actually, I think, somewhere where um, adopting a dual approach to methodology for historical Jesus studies, where it's not just the memory studies, but it's also the traditional criteria,
Yeah.
where so even as I was reading Dale Allison's latest book, what is it, Interpreting Jesus, or
Oh yeah, this one, yeah, from the last few months. Yep.
yeah, and he even he's come back and he's like, all right, so the criterion of embarrassment, that's like the best one out of all the other ones, and yeah, he seemed quite positive about that, and it seems like maybe um, maybe we could utilize some of the criteria to help us, specifically the criterion of embarrassment, to help us see that the situation was more historical. So I'm thinking of, women being the first to see the empty tomb, criteria of embarrassment as it applies to that and that sort of thing. So just if you are open to kind of utilizing a dual approach, it seems like you're going to have more ammo at your disposal, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, in that regard, I definitely am. I do have a footnote that states just that I think the criteria are not dismissed, and I actually say that I think they can go hand in hand with some of the memory aspects. Yeah. That being said, I would say that is really like someone's PhD dissertation in and of itself.
Mm.
And so that's why I didn't sort of like assume that or make the case for it, because it'd be such a huge case. So rather, my book basically says that, or the assumption behind it is that there has been really good work on criteria of authenticity and the case for Jesus' resurrection using that, such as Mike Licona, Gary Habermas,
Right.
people like William Lane Craig and others. And then, though, because there's the challenges to the criteria and a memory approach is put forward, I basically wanted to say, well, what could be said if you just use a memory approach rather than bringing in additional criteria? And there's a sense in which if my project fails, I could have said, oh, don't worry, you can still use the criteria approach. I think there's still good reason to use it. But then, in a sense, mine says, no, even on the memory approach, it's not like Christians have lost the case. There's nothing that can be said there. Yeah, so it's still useful. There's a good, strong case for that. But I do agree with you that really the strongest way would be to, in a sense, use both. Yeah, but I don't, strictly speaking, make that case. Yeah.
Yeah, and my so I had a chapter. I recently published a book with Cascade on an analytic theology of evangelism, and in the first chapter, we talk about just kind of what is the gospel, and it was like reliability of the gospel and the gospel message and that sort of thing. And so I do my my best attempt to try to put on a biblical scholar hat, where I try to argue that people have been a little too quick, a little too hasty with rejecting some of the criteria, and putting forth more of a dual approach. But I'll have to send it to you so you can tell me how horrible I did in reference to trying to do that.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah, that's good.
But yeah, no, thanks very much. We're out of time, but tell me what you're working on now.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm sort of in between, in the sense that I am someone who, like, if you read my background, I say like, oh, I teaches here, teaches here, teaches there, which can kind of sound wonderful, and I am very thankful for the opportunities they have, but also means I've basically failed to find a full-time position. So in that sense, I'm still looking. I still sort of teach where I can, and so on the calendar, like this year, I'm actually helping out at Curtin University's business school, which is not my main area, but still apply and be a little bit useful there. I'm grading for philosophy of religion for Morling, the Australian Baptists. I've also got to teach apologetics for Australian College of Ministry.
Nice.
And again, apologetics for Alpha Crucis, the Pentecostals in Australia. And yet, even if you know my background, I just, Catholic, I also help out at Notre Dame, Australia. But I should say Notre Dame, sorry, I guess for you. Yeah. But it depends on what class they have and availability and stuff like that. So I guess I sort of see myself as more making a general case for Christianity, and that's something
Oh,
that Christians, whether the Pentecostal, um, charismatic, Catholic, or Protestant, like we do agree Jesus died and rose
yeah.
again, and so that's sort of where I really want to focus on. I find interesting and sort of valuable. Yeah, so I do have two journal articles. They've already been accepted, coming out with JET, the Evangelical Theological
Mhm.
Society, called. So it's a two-parter. One of those annoying. You get the first part and it just sort of stops midway. Just wasn't allowed to do like a 16,000 word journal. But yep. And I'm working on actually a book review of James Ware's The Final Triumph of God, which, yeah, I'd highly recommend for anyone on First Corinthians 15. It's basically better than my work on that. But yeah, I guess it doesn't talk about memory, so I've still got something to offer. Yep. But yeah, and I'm also trying to look at the question of whether memory can take you back to the event.
Mm.
So there's some there who are wanting to say that, memory just gets you to the mind of the remember
Mhm,
and nothing
mhm.
else. And in short, there's sort of nuances in how people say it, but I'd just say the main reason why it's probably in the mind and the memory is the best explanation is because that's what they
Uh-huh.
observe, that's what witness, and that's why they sort of have that memory. And so it doesn't give you certainty of it, but it does make it more probable not
Right.
that that's sort of what gave rise. And so trying to uh, do an article on that.
Awesome. Well, that's exciting stuff. And thank you again for coming along and talking with me here.
No, you're welcome. Yeah, and thank you for your work. I've definitely appreciated it. You've had probably lots of great work, but I've particularly followed some of your work on epistemology, and that's a blessing. Like, how do we know stuff? So yeah, really important.
Well, thanks.